At some point during the recording of one of his albums in the early to mid-1970s, George Carlin raised a hand, and the session stopped. The engineer on the other side of the glass looked up. The technicians in the room looked at Carlin. The producer, whoever was in that role that night, waited. Carlin stood in the recording booth, the microphone still live, and he was quiet for a moment that was longer than a technical pause. He said something was wrong, not the sound, not the recording level, not anything the equipment could explain or the engineer could fix. Something in the material itself, something in the way the bit had just come out that was not the way it was supposed to come out. The session held while Carlin thought. The room waited in the particular suspension of a professional recording session, paused by something no one in the room except the performer had identified. Nobody argued. Nobody explained that what he had just recorded was perfectly serviceable, technically clean, functionally complete. They waited. And in waiting, they gave the album the thing that would later make people describe it as one of the most precisely made comedy recordings of its era. Carlin's insistence that what was on the tape be the same as what was in his head. Not approximately the same, not close enough, the same. That insistence cost time. It cost patience from everyone else in the room. It cost money in the specific and measurable sense that studio time costs money. But what it produced, what came out the other end of that process, was something that sounded unlike the comedy albums people had been making up to that point, in ways that were harder to specify than to hear. The moment the session stopped, the moment Carlin raised his hand and the room went quiet, was a specific kind of moment that everyone in recording studios recognizes and nobody particularly enjoys. It is the moment when the person whose vision the session exists to serve has identified a problem that the technology and the expertise in the room cannot solve, because the problem is not technical. It is the moment when all the equipment falls away, and what remains is the question of whether what was just recorded is true. Carlin stood in the booth and worked through it. He was not working loudly, not pacing and gesticulating, not involving the people on the other side of the glass in his internal process. He was doing what he always did when he was in the middle of figuring something out. He was being very still and very quiet, and his face had the particular expression of a person who is listening to something that only he can hear. The engineer waited. The producer waited. The clock on the studio wall moved in the way that studio clocks move when the session is paused and the meter is still running, each minute carrying its specific financial weight. And then Carlin said what needed to change. Not approximately, specifically. The specific word that was wrong, the specific pause that was in the wrong place, the specific rhythm of a sentence that was set up correctly but landed incorrectly because of a single syllable that hadn't been handled the way he had intended it. The engineer made the note. They set up again. And Carlin went back to the microphone. This time, something was different. It was subtle enough that the people on the other side of the glass might not have been able to point to exactly what it was. But the material had found its shape. The specific thing he had been trying to say was now being said in the specific way he had meant to say it. The gap between the intention and the execution had closed. He ran through the bit again, and when it was done, he did not raise his hand. He stood at the microphone for a moment, the performer's particular stillness of someone who has just completed a difficult piece of work and is checking internally whether it is finished. Then he looked through the glass at the engineer and nodded. To understand what Carlin was listening for in that studio, it helps to understand what he had been trying to do with his live material for several years by the time the recordings were being made. His comedy in the early 1970s was not simply a set of jokes arranged in an order that produced maximum laughs. It was something more architectural than that, a structure in which each piece of material connected to the pieces around it, in which the rhythm of the language was as important as the content, in which the specific words he chose were chosen because those words, and not other words, were the right ones. He was writing comedy the way a poet thinks about a poem, with constant attention to what each element was doing, with no tolerance for approximation. This made him a demanding person to record. The engineers and producers who worked with him in those years were working with someone who heard the material differently than they did. They heard a comedy performance, a voice, a sound level, a timing that was either within acceptable range or outside it. Carlin heard the material, the words, the rhythm, the specific quality of each bit's delivery, the way a line landed or didn't land, or landed sideways in a way that was almost right, but not quite right. Almost right was a problem. Almost right, for Carlin, was a form of failure. Not a dramatic failure, not a failure that would be audible to most people who eventually bought and played the record, but a failure in the specific sense that he would know, every time he heard the playback, that the thing on the tape was not the thing he had actually meant. The gap between what he meant and what was on the tape was the gap he could not accept. In the recording sessions that produced his most significant albums, that refusal to accept the gap is what can be heard in the final product, not as an absence of something, but as the presence of something it is difficult to name. The quality of material that has been brought all the way to its own edge, rather than stopped slightly before it. Most performers never get there. Most performers are stopped before they reach that edge by time or money or the reasonable judgment of other people in the room that what has already been captured is good enough. Carlin was stopped by none of those things when he was working well. He was stopped only by his own judgment that the material had arrived at where it needed to be. The album that came out of those sessions, whether Class Clown in 1972 or one of the records that followed it in the years immediately after, arrived in the world with a quality that reviewers and listeners found difficult to articulate, but easy to hear. It sounded like someone had thought carefully about every word, which was true. It sounded like someone had refused to accept the version that was almost right, which was also true. It sounded like someone had been in the room with the material long enough to find out what it actually was. The comedians who studied those albums, the ones who were young and serious about the work in the 1970s, and who played Carlin's records on their turntables and listened to the specific way each bit was constructed and paced and delivered, often described a quality in the recordings that they couldn't find in other comedy albums of the same era. A tightness, a sense of nothing wasted, a feeling that every element of every bit was exactly where it needed to be. That quality was not accidental. It was the accumulated result of hundreds of decisions, made in the recording booth and in the rehearsal process and in the writing and rewriting again. But the moment that crystallized it, the moment that best represents the sensibility that produced those records, was the moment Carlin raised his hand and the session stopped. Not because something was wrong in any way that a non-performer would have noticed, but because he had heard something that was not yet right, and he would not put something on tape that was not yet right, regardless of what it cost in time or patience or money or the professional discomfort of everyone else in the room. That is an unusual quality in any artist, and it is particularly unusual in a comedian, because comedy is a medium that rewards the willingness to be good enough, that functions, commercially and professionally, quite well on the almost right version of things. You do not need to go all the way to the edge to have a successful comedy career. Most successful comedy careers are built on material that is very good, but not entirely precise. Carlin's best work is built on something different. It is built on the specific insistence, renewed each time, at each session, in each rewrite, that the material on the tape be the material he actually meant. That the thing the audience eventually heard be the thing he had actually been trying to say. In the recording studio, on the night the sessions stopped, the engineer on the other side of the glass did not know what Carlin was listening for. He heard a competent recording of strong material. He heard something that, by any professional standard, was ready. Carlin heard something else. He heard the gap between what was on the tape and what was in his head, and he would not close the session until the gap was gone. He raised his hand. The room went quiet. And they did it again. And this time, it was right.